Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kyla Hanington, and it is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Office of Human Rights and our event partners, the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, for tonight's program, which is a second in our series, Does Your Zip Code Impact Your Whole Life? Tonight's important discussion will focus on the area of housing, and we are delighted to have with us three guest speakers. Dr. Bruce Mitchell from NCRC, Chazi Diggs, a real estate professional in our county, and Charles Floyd, a senior investigator with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights. Our moderator for tonight's event is the executive director of the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, Renée Battlebrooks.
And thank you so much, Kyla. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We think this is a really, really important conversation. And so we are delighted to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Bruce Mitchell. He is an NCRC research senior analyst, and he's going to explain to us what NCRC is. He works as an urban geographer. He recognizes the crucial role of place in determining the range of economic opportunities available to people. He specializes in the application of quantitative methods, including conventional and spatial statistics, remote sensing and geographic information systems, GIS, to analyze patterns of inequity in U.S. cities. He is deeply interested in the historical and structural factors which have shaped the present demographic and social economic patterns of neighborhoods. These factors include segregation, redlining, suburbanization, try that fast 5 times, urban renewal, and gentrification. He has published works on environmental justice and disparities in access to financial services for minorities and people of lower economic status in U.S. cities. Bruce holds a PhD in geography and environmental science and policy from the University of South Florida School of Geosciences. So we welcome Dr. Mitchell. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I greatly appreciate the opportunity of being here tonight and presenting this information, because what we're going to be talking about tonight is something that's really important to the urban structure and how residential segregation took place in American cities. You can say that redlining, in a sense, and residential segregation, they put the structure into structural racism in a quite literal sense for America's neighborhoods. So I'll be talking tonight about redlining. But first off, let me talk a little bit about NCRC. So National Community Reinvestment Coalition, we're an organization that has 600 members nationwide, and we're focused on building wealth opportunities for low and moderate income households in this country. So a lot of the focus of our work is on combating the issue of redlining and supporting what's called the Community Reinvestment Act, which obligates banks to invest in all communities where they operate, whether they be upper income, low income, moderate income. So that's our focus. So tonight we're looking at, does your zip code impact your whole life? And as a geographer, you know, what we study is the impact of place and how much places can structure the opportunities available to individuals. And when we're talking about residential segregation, I like to refer to these 4 pillars that really built the structure of residential segregation in the United States. And the first of these being restrictive covenants. And these were deed restrictions that required of sale of a property to white people. It was written right into the deed of a property that you could not sell to an African American, often to a Semitic person, meaning Jewish or of Arabic descent. There were a whole list of different minorities that could be that the sale could be restricted from. Then there were community associations that would require the neighborhood approval of a sale, depending upon the person trying to buy a property. Now, redlining, that's where banks and the Federal Housing Administration, importantly, refuse to make loans in minority areas. There's also residential steering. the practice of realtors to only show properties in segregated areas. So white families only be shown properties in the white areas of a town, black families only shown property in the black areas. And then social pressure and violence. So we can't underestimate the impact of this, that community pressure and mob harassment and violence against black families who attempted to purchase property in white areas. So these four things really created this segregated structure. So if we look at this, why is it still an issue today? And the reason is because these measures were in place for decades, right? Restrictive covenants, they weren't ruled unenforceable until 1948. Redlining, the federal government practiced redlining until President Kennedy banned it in 1962. Steering by realtors, that was perfectly legal up until the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And social pressure and violence, that's more subtle today and more nuanced today, perhaps depending upon where you live. So these things were in place for a very long time, and also at a time in which you had tremendous changes taking place in urban areas of the United States, the post-World War II time period. And the reason this period is so important is because there was huge pent-up demand for housing after a decade with the Great Depression and then the war. Suburbanization, large-scale suburbanization took place during this era in which you had the development of tract homes. And things like the GI Bill, VA loans, the FHA, they provided mostly white people the opportunity to buy homes within these large-scale tract home developments that form the suburbs. So the FHA was actively engaging in redlining during this era. And you also had other developments like the federal highway system, which facilitated travel between suburbs, downtown areas, and blockbusting and white flight from downtown core areas, which is particularly impactful on Baltimore. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about Baltimore, and then we'll talk about the Washington region. So how did a New Deal agency, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, contribute to redlining? Well, what the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, was, it was an agency that was set up in 1933, and what was happening at that time? Massive bank failures and foreclosures. So the HOLC was bailing out and providing new mortgages to people who were in jeopardy of having their home foreclosed on. And they did this on a pretty impartial basis. They made loans both to white and to black households during this time period, and they purchased over 1 million loans. This period of the HOLC's activity lasted until about 1935. It's what they did after that that is, I think, key to what we're discussing in Redlining tonight, and that's the city survey program they engaged in, where they wanted to find out, well, what's the risk of these mortgages that we've purchased? How do we assess the risk? And they created what are called the residential security maps. They went to over 240 cities throughout the United States and created these residential security maps. And what these do is they provide a snapshot of residential segregation and where lenders would or would not make mortgages in this period immediately prior to the Second World War. So what did this look like? Here we have an example of the Baltimore redlining map, residential security map, and the examiner's grading sheet to the right. And what this examiner's grading sheet is, this is a standardized form that the HOLC examiners, they would fill this out for each neighborhood they were assessing within a community. And the way they would do this, they would talk to mortgage lenders, they would talk to banking officials, to appraisers, to realtors in the area, and they would do a profile of the different neighborhoods. And it would include things like site and situation, transportation access, the amenities that were available. It also looked at what were the priors in terms of sales and how were sales going on. However, another important factor of it was they looked at the class of the people living there in these neighborhoods, and they looked at their ethnic and racial background. So this was included as part of this evaluation that HOLC was doing. And the grades they gave, it was a 4-tier grading system. So you see the areas in the Baltimore map that are green. These are considered to be the best areas by the HOLC, ones that you had higher property values, and also they're generally white areas of the city. The blue areas were the still desirable. The yellow areas were classified as definitely declining areas within the city. And then finally, the lowest grade, the redlined areas, they received a D grade and were classified as hazardous. So there was no lending that was going to take place in these hazardous neighborhoods, these redline neighborhoods of the city. And this is the 1937 map of Baltimore we're looking at here. And what we find if we look at these individual redline neighborhoods is we find invariably in the Baltimore map that they have a high Black and high immigrant population within Baltimore. In fact, all the neighborhoods in Baltimore that had any presence at all of African Americans were classified either as de-hazardous or definitely declining. If there was a very small population of African Americans, they could still be graded as definitely declining. So this is the sort of situation that we have in Baltimore that made lending very difficult in that downtown core area. And if you notice, what are the areas that are green and blue on here, the desirable areas, they tend to be further out in the city structure of a place like Baltimore. And these are the areas which expanded and the suburbs expanded out from. So what ramifications does this have for people today, right? Well, in West Baltimore, it was given a hazardous rating. Today, life expectancy at birth is 70.3 years. The poverty rate is almost 40%, and the minority population in West Baltimore is over 87% minority. If you look at a green area, Guilford in Baltimore, which is developed by the Roland Park Corporation, this is an affluent area. Today, life expectancy is 15 years more than in West Baltimore, 85.8 years. The poverty rate is half what it is in West Baltimore, and the number of minorities living there is again half what it is in West Baltimore. So this is what we see over and over again within cities, this persisting structure where the areas that were graded highly tend to have higher socioeconomic status and also have higher measurements of health, better health, and life expectancy. And this shows what the results are nationally. And here we're looking at the HOLC grades and income. And the first column over here says best. Those are the green areas. 91% of those areas today are middle and upper income areas to this day. On the other end of the spectrum, the hazardous areas all the way to the right of this chart, hazardous areas, 75% of those are low to moderate income today. Look at demographics. The best areas, they're almost 86% white majority at this point, while the hazardous areas are almost 64% minority neighborhoods. So this is a persisting structure that was put in place within American cities. And it impacts more than just the economics of the area. It has direct effects on the health, as we saw with life expectancy. So this is, again, national figures, and there are significantly higher proportions of minorities, higher rates of poverty, lower life expectancy, and then in health indicators, higher rates of asthma, high cholesterol, COPD, diabetes, hypertension, kidney disease, lower status of mental health, more obesity, higher stroke. All of these statistically significantly higher in the redlined areas than they are in the areas that were graded highly. So we've talked about Baltimore quite a bit. And unfortunately, well, I don't know if it's unfortunate or not, there is no HOLC map of Washington, D.C. or the surrounding area. But what we do have is an FHA map. This is an FHA map of the Washington region that was done in 1937. And the FHA followed very similar sort of grading logic, right? And when they looked at neighborhoods, instead of a 4-tier scale, they're using an 8-category scale. And these maps are very rare for the FHA because the FHA destroyed their maps back in 1969 as a result of a lawsuit. They went and wholesale destroyed their map. So it's rare to find an FHA map. There's one of Chicago. There's this one of Washington, D.C. but hard to get. In their grading system, okay, they had a G, and that was the lowest grade. It was specifically designed for white neighborhoods only. The F areas, these are areas that were classified as rapidly tending to become slums and had an African American population. Then the very lowest rating was the H areas, the poorest grade of housing developed especially for African Americans in that classification. So this map's kind of hard to see, right? Let's look at one where we have put in the colors on it and might be a little bit easier to see. So this one of the DC region, you see these G areas. These were areas that were the lowest grading white area. And you see areas in Montgomery County extending up, I guess, around Aspen Hill, Georgia Avenue corridor. You see the area of Potomac had a G rating. And then areas within Prince George's County have G ratings that are abutting Washington, D.C. There are many areas along in there. Also in Virginia. Kind of the difference being here, though, that for the most part, in Virginia and in Montgomery County, these areas, particularly Potomac, developed into upper income type areas as a result of suburbanization taking place in the 1950s and 60s. So you had a real change taking place there. On the other hand, you find the F areas, and that was the area that encompassed almost the entire downtown core of Washington, D.C., extending over into Anacostia, was all graded as F. And then the H areas, the lowest grade where African Americans lived. And there you see extending from Anacostia, from Deanwood, over into Prince George's County. There's also an H area up towards Silver Spring, and almost on the borderline there between PG County and Montgomery County. So in terms of redlining within Prince George's County, there was substantial redlining that took place historically within these areas of Prince George's County. So what do we conclude from all of this? Well, the HOLC maps, what they do is they document the segregated structure of American cities at the time. The underwriting policies of private banks, the FHA and the VA reinforced this structure well into the 1960s. And this concentrated disadvantage in ways that impact neighborhoods today. And I think that's the real signal term here, is that they concentrated disadvantage within these areas that made it very hard with disinvestment for these areas to recover and to really prosper. Because that redlining impacted not only mortgages, it also impacted the capability oftentimes to get business loans too within areas. So this is something that has carried forward to this day because of this persisting structure that we have in place. And if you want to see more, you want to look at more of the HOLC maps, what I recommend is the University of Richmond Digital Scholarship Lab. They have hosted all of the redlining maps that are in existence. They've also hosted our Not Even Past project, which is a public health look, where you can look at each of these neighborhoods. Unfortunately, only Baltimore and Maryland is available. But you can look at these neighborhoods and see what was the grading in the past and what are the health outcomes today, and also rates of poverty, rates of minority population in these areas. So I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to present this, and I'll turn it back to you, Renee.
So Bruce, that was really, really helpful. I have so many questions, but I'm going to wait because I want to get the rest of the panel on, but I'm processing and I'm trying to figure out what this looks like for allies, but we're going to talk about that. So thank you. We're going to hear next from Chazi Diggs. And Chazi is a licensed real estate agent at Capital Structures Real Estate LLC, based in Bowie, Prince George's County, Maryland. He's licensed in Maryland and the District of Columbia. He specializes in distressed houses and first-time home buyers. He holds a housing opportunity for all certification provided by the state of Maryland. He is also the chair of the Young Professionals Network of Prince George's County Association of Realtor and serves as a board member for the Financial Empowerment Center at Prince George's Community College. He is a native Prince Georgian and holds a Bachelor of Science in Communication Studies from Towson and an MBA from the University of Maryland Global Campus. So Chazi, we welcome you tonight. So we look forward to your presentation.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Oops. All right. And so today, first off, want to thank you guys for having me once again. It's always a pleasure working alongside the Office of Human Rights, as well as the Prince George Municipal Library System. I greatly appreciate it and look forward to doing more business with you all in the future. So today I'm here to present on how zip codes matter from a housing perspective. And so it all depends on the zip code. That's basically what it boils down to. That's the reason why we're here today. We can move on to the next slide, if you will. I'm also on Instagram Live right now. So if I'm looking both ways, I'm talking to you guys and the audience as well. You can skip past this one. This one was the introduction that you guys gave. So the premise of it is, can you break the pull of a zip code? Most people cannot, unfortunately. And so I would like to talk about how, from a social impact, a housing impact, and a political impact, zip codes are arguably the biggest impact on one person's life. And so we can move forward. All right, so I can start out with a couple stats just to get everybody going. So in 2020, there were 37.2 million people in poverty, and African Americans and Hispanics represent 36.5% of the poverty rate. And this is per the Census Bureau. All this information is readily available on the census website. And so moving forward, just from a social aspect, your zip code is everything. Because from a culture aspect, we learn about everything we know based upon our zip code. Say, for example, we are Prince Georgians. We know about the scene, the social scene. We know about where to go, where not to go, where to hang out at night, where to avoid. All of this stuff is based upon our zip code. And also from our friends, oftentimes our first childhood friends are people that we knew, people that we are familiar with, people that we are living near. And from a well-being aspect, like the doctor mentioned earlier, there's so many factors into well-being, whereas like the pollution aspect, whereas in Baltimore it's a few studies out there that focuses upon the pollution and how pollution has impacted their life expectancy, asthma rates in urban areas, things like that. That is all dependent on zip code. And so moving forward into the next slide, I just want to talk about it from a housing impact. From a housing impact, rent burden. Rent burden is a hot topic right now because we are all trying to obtain affordable housing in whichever way someone sees fit. So the definition of rent burden is if you're going over 30% of your monthly income, you are considered rent burden. And so roughly 50% of all Americans are considered rent burden. Whereas, like I stated, they pay more than the 30% of their monthly income. That is a big factor in your zip code, because your zip code, you learn so many different aspects of where can I live, what can I afford to live, what type of housing am I allowed to live in, and things of that nature. And a hot market. Everybody know about hot markets. That's a term when you cut on the TV, where you hop on Instagram, hop on Twitter, hop on the news. You're talking about hot market, just talking about mortgage rates, talking about all this and that. Hot market. Where's the live? And when you turn on the news, you see, okay, this is they do zip trips throughout the year. Like they go from, sometimes they may be in Oxon Hill, sometimes they may be out in Gaithersburg. These are hot markets because obviously there's something that's interesting to the consumer that people would like to learn more about. And quality of life, I already stated that a little bit earlier. Just from the aspect of you want to live in peace and quiet. Sometimes that zip code matters. Some people are more more lenient, so they're more willing to live in urban areas where, you know, a little more, the streets are a little bit more crowded, a little more noisy. And some people, they prefer the suburban lifestyle, more quiet streets, you know, your neighbor next to your left, to your right, all of that. And moving forward to the last slide of this portion is the political impact. So zoning is something that really is a hot topic right now, as in the state of Maryland. For an example, I read a few weeks ago that parts of Western Maryland was trying to move to West Virginia because they felt as that West Virginia is more affiliated with how they feel about their mindset and, you know, their political affiliation. And, you know, political affiliation moving forward, yes, that's oftentimes is dependent upon where you live. And that's a pretty much if you're around a area where you're, you know, predominant, you're going to be more lenient to what's going on around you. And funding. The funding is provided, you know, from a school aspect. That's definitely a great impact. Your schools, your taxes, all of that plays into zip code. And so, like I said, zip code is very, very important. We can move on to the next slide. So how can this be fixed? I believe that education is definitely that's the starting point, because oftentimes when you go to these schools, you talk to teachers, they talk about what's going on, what's right, what's not. And they, you know, sometimes we have teachers out here that feel pretty dissatisfied with where one person can live can determine their type of education or the type of lunch that they're getting, the type of resources that they have for after school, things of that nature. That is all dependent upon your education. So we got to start there with trying to be a better person from education standpoint. And moving forward to, you know, to focus upon the adults. Oh, I'm sorry, we can go back. Sorry about that. And so mentorship is definitely another thing that I think helps, because, you know, we got to be able to strengthen our workforce, strengthen one another with different nonprofits or things of that nature. One of the things that we've done early in the year, me and a few of our friends, we did a homeless drive. We went to the DC tent cities and went things of that nature. We went to the tent cities and we gave them toiletries that they needed. And my last tip on how this can be fixed is to become recession proof. What does recession proof mean? That is basically changing the workforce from a predominantly frontline worker aspect and giving them the objectivity and learning about different access and different resources that people may or may not have learned. So say for example, like coding tech, we are moving to a remote workforce in this DC area. You know, like let's start, because I know at Prince George Community College, they offered AWS training to people that fit criteria. It's just from an aspect of we got to do a better job of getting this voice out here, this knowledge out here. And I think that's really important. And that's for these next 10 years, I think being able to, with all this automation and metaverse and all these, you got to become more recession proof, if you will. And so moving on to the next slide. So I conclude on this. Zip codes shape you as much as your upbringing does at the end of the day. From the beginning of, from the time you, like, from where you're born at in the hospital, that's based upon your zip code, to what type of school you went to. Were you in early education? Were you guys given the opportunity to get a head start in preschool? Or did you guys not have that implementation at your school, at your neighborhood? Then moving forward to primary education, the average reading level of an American is at a 5th grade reading level. Like, these are things that are dependent upon your zip code. And basically, that's my premise from a real estate standpoint on how zip codes matter.
So thank you, Chazi. That was really good. I have some questions for you as well. But we're going to bring on our last panelist, and then we'll bring everybody. And then I'd like us all to kind of discuss from our various perspectives. So thank you. We are going to have our third panelist. Last but not least is Charles Floyd, our special guest. He is a senior investigator with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights. And he's been an investigator with our agency for the last 14 years. and his work includes complex investigations into allegations of employment, public accommodations, and housing discrimination. He is a subject matter expert in Prince George's County's anti-discrimination legislation, and he trains, he mentors, and he supports new investigators, as well as provides training to businesses around Prince George's County. So, Charles, we thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having me. So what I want to do is just kind of discuss housing investigations. Within the county, our office, the Office of Human Rights, investigates housing for the county. And we're currently in a push to spread the word that there's a place you can go if you believe you've been discriminated against in housing. Some of the protected areas in housing that we investigate are typical things that you hear about: race, religion, sex, national origin. But there are also some newer areas that we cover, or like maybe not as well known, such as personal appearance, political opinion, familial status. We've just added citizenship, immigration, and source of income to areas to bases that we investigate as far as housing goes. So when it comes to housing and investigations, if you believe you've been discriminated against in the area of housing, you have 360 days from the incident to contact our office to possibly file a complaint. And that starts with an intake appointment, and that's when you meet with an investigator to discuss why you believe you were discriminated against. And with housing discrimination, the law that we cover is very dense. It's just a lot of areas, a lot of nuances to it. So I just want to kind of give some examples of things that we look into, or, situations that people go through that they may just let go or just move on from it and don't think about it, but it could be possible discrimination. And things tonight discussing like zip codes, that is definitely something that is not a protected area directly, but it can relate to areas such as race, religion, national origin, because growing up here in Prince George's County, I grew up in Capitol Heights. So once I said I was from Capitol Heights, or I said I was from 20743, sometimes I would get looks, or people would have a perception about me. And like kind of going back to what they were saying, the schools I went to, the high schools I went to had a reputation that kind of hindered me possibly in areas of my life. But that can also translate to housing. If you're a person who's out looking for housing in a certain area and you fill out an application, but once they see the zip code that you're from, they may make comments like, oh, that's the area from where the immigrants live, or that's where the area where it's majority of this race, or it's majority of this religion. And then you're denied the housing on it. That's something that we can look into. If you are a parent and you have children and you fill out an application for a available apartment and you meet the minimum qualifications for it, but when you show up there with your children to sign the lease, now they're like, oh, well, we're not gonna, now that the apartment's gone, we prefer to lease it to someone who does not have children. That's familial status, but that can also be filled in with any other basis that we cover. It could be because, oh, I'm Black and I've met the qualifications, but when I walked in, they saw that I was Black, and now they're like, now the tune has changed. Or if you go to a financial lender and they're asking you about, let's say they see your zip code, and then they start asking you questions about your citizenship status or immigration status, and then now you're being denied. Well, first off, they shouldn't ask you those questions anyway, because it shouldn't play a factor. Long as you have a legal source of money that comes in, then you can pay your rent and pay what you need to pay. Those questions shouldn't even come up. That's a form of discrimination in housing. Or if you want to go to a certain area, once again, going back to zip codes, if you want to go to the areas that are considered quote unquote more favorable, and you go up there with a realtor, and the realtor says things to discourage you from going there. They may say, oh, well, this area prefers people of this religion, or they prefer people of this race or familial status, to discourage you from going there. That's a form of housing discrimination. And that's just a few of the examples. But like I said before, it's very dense, it's very nuanced. So if you believe that you've been through situations like that, or if you believe you have, or you're not sure you have, and you just want to talk to someone about it, like I said, you can contact our office at 301-883-6170, or you can check out our website on the county website, and you can schedule an intake appointment. You'll talk with an investigator or investigators, and we can determine if the things that you bring up meet the initial elements of possible discrimination. I will say, and if you want to file a complaint, I always encourage everyone to document. If there's emails, if there's text messages, save them, don't get rid of them. If you have witnesses, if you have people who were present when you were denied this housing, or comments were made, or you're being coerced or threatened not to get housing or to move out or somewhere, bring those things with you. So that's kind of the main thing I wanted to say to everyone. So I just want to spread the word. There is a place you can come within the county that deals with housing. We investigate housing. We're looking to increase our housing numbers, because I think a lot of people are hesitant or don't know that there is a place they can come to. And ultimately, our goal is it's a catch-22. We want to increase the numbers, but we also want to educate and eradicate the discrimination. And in addition, if anyone is a landlord or someone who deals with housing or financial lenders, and you want some type of training on housing law, on what to do, what not to do, we can also be contacted for that, where we can provide that training if needed. So that's pretty much it. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Charles. So if we could bring all of our panelists back. This is excellent. We'll wait for Bruce. All right. So excellent. So I think what we have provided is really a different lens for everyone to look through when we talk about this broad issue of, does your zip code affect you in particular when it comes to housing? But I think, as everyone has pretty much said, it really affects everything. It affects everything. All of the systems really that can be discriminatory, whether it's education, employment, etc. So let's start off with gentrification. That's sort of the other end of the spectrum from my perspective of sort of the redlining, but it is connected. This is my layman's view. It looks like after we did all of the redlining and suburbia flourished, and now people are wanting to move in to the city, sort of trends are changing and pushing out the poor people that were left in the city as the redlining. So can we talk about that issue from our different lenses, what it looks like? We know why it's happening, but maybe we don't. And kind of unpack that a little bit more for us. What are things we need to look out for? Urban planners, what can we do, et cetera, et cetera. So if that question makes sense, I open it up for anybody to talk about, first of all, what is gentrification? I think we all know, but maybe, and then talk about the complexities of that.
If you'd like, I can just talk a little bit about this because we've done some research on gentrification, particularly in Washington, D.C., which we found in our report between 2000 and 2013 had the highest intensity of gentrification of any city in the country. And what we meant by intensity was the number of neighborhoods that were eligible to gentrify that were at the bottom in terms of income, in terms of home values, that then rose to the top at the end of the 10-year period. So gentrification, redlining, disinvestment, and abandonment are often processes that precede gentrification. You have property in an area that's been devalued, greatly devalued, and certainly disinvestment and abandonment take place in those areas. So redlining in some ways prepared the groundwork for gentrification. And you'll notice in our national figures on redlining, 25% of the hazardous neighborhoods now are middle and upper income neighborhoods. So I suspect that most often you'll find gentrification took place in those neighborhoods.
So what do you think is driving the highest intensity of Washington, D.C. versus other cities?
Well, revitalization and redevelopment, oftentimes connected with development around metro stations on the Red Line and the Green Line. We find a close connection between transportation access, city planning, and the wholesale redevelopment of areas. In some cases, it can be revitalization. And revitalization gives the economic benefits, but it doesn't involve the displacement that gentrification does, because gentrification implies that populations are being displaced. And we found that over 20,000 African American families were displaced in Washington, D.C. during that time period between 2000 and 2010 in these gentrifying areas.
Interesting. So following sort of that train of thought, no pun intended, is so perhaps DC was one of the main cities that was revamping their transit system, like we were. I mean,
there was massive investment taking place in
DC. So you think that's
that time period? Yes.
More so than other cities
yes.
Percentage wise. Okay, interesting. It certainly does. It certainly does create other issues, right? On one hand, everybody is great for the development, and right, but you forget about the people that you forgot about for years, generations. You left them with nothing, and all of a sudden you want what they have. And so displacement into places perhaps that aren't equipped to, they don't perhaps have the resources needed to assist. I don't know. It is very complex. I think about sort of Anacostia, in terms of gentrification, and something that I've kind of watched, as I travel to and from, when I go Suitland Parkway, and it's like, where have they pushed everyone?
Well, the University of Minnesota School of Law did a study, and they looked at Washington, D.C. specifically to these areas that were being gentrified and how the population change was taking place. And they found that oftentimes there was an increase in upper income people in these neighborhoods. And apparently, many of them moved to Prince George's County. They were pushed further out into the urban system from their neighborhoods. So, yes, people are pushed out. They then try and find housing in areas that's affordable.
Yeah. Chazi, did you have anything you wanted to add from your perspective?
I was going to say, for example, most of the times, I guess revitalization is one of those things where it's it's really a great asset to the people that it benefits. And so, for example, let me think about within the county, where we have been able to see the evolution of Suitland, Maryland, basically start the process of being revitalized in this aspect. But oftentimes we are forgetting, we think that by putting new $400,000 townhomes, that then there will be an influx of non-natives in a sense. Whereas I think what we need to start moving forward to is trying to figure out how can we, as a total county, start to do better with trying to find affordable housing for all. Because at this point in time, the median house sale this past month has reached over $400,000. And so, when we're talking about first-time home buyers, we're talking about that $275,000 to $325,000 or lower, and so I think what we're really and truly going to start to see play over these next few years with more and more remote work and more when this purple line that's going on and things of that nature, we're going to start seeing more and more minorities continue to be pushed away from Prince George's, and it's like you're going to start going, branching out. Because I saw, for example, last week there was an article in WTOP about the next suburban area is somewhere you're not even thinking about in the DC area. And what was it? It was Baltimore. Like stuff like that. That's always been a common theme. People, people like, oh, Baltimore. But where we started dealing with first time home buyers and who are pre-approved at $250,000, they have a kid with them. They may not be trying to do that condo route because condos oftentimes you have to have an FHA approval. It must be an FHA approved condo, which means that the delinquency rate has to be below 15%. And in the Prince George's County, there's not that many that aren't in delinquency. So then it's a bunch of unintended consequences that occurs from a outside perspective. And so I think really and truly we're going to start to see more and more migration away from these dense populations.
What do you think, Chazi, is sort of a 30,000 viewpoint solution?
So I think the long-term solution is we have to be more serious about our initiatives that we're talking about. It's not in anybody's necessarily control. It's going to take a group initiative effort to start to try to bridge these gaps between minorities and wealth and things of that nature. Because, for example, we're starting to see they're in the process of trying to rezone Prince George's and Montgomery County, in a sense, to more reflect the population growth in Prince George's and Montgomery County. People may think that that's a great idea. You're basically in an aspect is unintended segregation because you're trying to get more like-minded people within the same niche. And so I think that may be an unintended consequence, but it's going to have to take a more appropriate response to try to attack these type of things from occurring. I mean, the state of Maryland, they're doing a great job because they're giving first-time home buyer programs and things of that nature. That Prince George's County, Prince George's Pathways, DC they can grant you up to $80,000 in down payment and closing assistance. It's stuff that's out there. Just people have to. I mean, we're going to do a overall better push about trying to get that knowledge out there, and so that's really what I think what's going to have to happen.
That's a great perspective. I wanted to ask, in the bio, in your introduction, it said that one of the things you specialize in is distressed housing. Explain what that is. Yeah.
And so distressed houses this is considered my niche in a sense. And so what I do is I'll be able to find properties that may or may not, that may be in probate or maybe in S shape, I guess, when somebody dies in the family, and I go over them, the pros of keeping, the cons of keeping it. It goes over the liens, basically I educate them on making their best decision at the end of the day. And so sometimes in distressed properties, it grants an opportunity to our first time home buyers who can't compete with a cash buyer, because oftentimes when in this market, it's not about how much you can offer, it's how much you can net the seller in a sense. And so by finding these type of homes that may be a little outdated, it may need a new kitchen, may need a cosmetic 2021 cosmetic, like the HGTV in a sense. So though I open prospective buyers to that mindset that you don't always have to get the latest and greatest. You can find it your own way, and I educate them on how they can find that.
Excellent. Bruce, there was a question I wanted to ask because kind of left it out there, but can you tell us a little bit more about, we know that the FHA destroyed their maps because of the lawsuit, but can you tell us a little bit about the lawsuit and about, I'm a very curious person because I'm a former prosecutor. So I think, destroying of evidence. Okay, but maybe unpack that for me.
Well, the context is this was 1968, 1969. You have Nixon coming into office, and you have a different regime over at the FHA, and they're served with a lawsuit, and they proceed to destroy the mapping evidence. Now, the HOLC, of course, could not destroy its maps because it was already defunct. And all their correspondence, their mapping had been turned over to the National Archives. So the HOLC maps, since HOLC and FHA shared an institutional logic on the grading of neighborhoods, that the HOLC maps provide a proxy for where FHA would or would not have lended during that time period. There was a recent study that was done, and they found that in the HOLC redlined areas between 1940 and about 1950, the FHA only made 1 or 2% of their loans in areas that had been graded hazardous by the HOLC. So you see this incredible investment taking place in America's suburbs, while America's downtown areas are being starved of mortgage lending and of investment.
Fascinating. There's something that I think Chazi talked about, rent burden. I want to sort of delve into that just for a second. And it's interesting. I always thought, well, I read somewhere, maybe I misread, some years ago that in the DMV, we pay a larger percentage of our income goes to housing than in other parts of the United States, probably except New York City or San Francisco, maybe at that time. But so first of all, if we know, sort of where do we rank when it comes to the percentage of our income that goes to our housing, whether it's mortgage or rent?
I can try. I don't have that information right on hand. But I can say, for example, it was a Washington Post article, I want to say at the beginning of the year, that stated that Prince George's County was the only place in the region where the mortgage mirrored the rent amount. That was where we were talking about the 1,800 to 2,000 range. That was like, it was really like the only area. But other than that, outside of that area, and so the median income for Prince George's is roughly $84,000, which is higher than the overall median of the United States of America. But when you start to consider like the $400,000 houses and the inflation, all that other stuff, that's when it starts to get a little tricky. That's when they start going over that 30% amount, because one of the things is in lending, for the conventional route, you are allowed to go up to 43% of your debt to income. And I believe it's somewhere in that same ballpark for FHA as well. But the FHA, they try to protect their mortgage a little bit more with mortgage insurance premiums and things of that nature. But for some, I've seen in some instances, people can go all the way up to 50% of their monthly income, which is a little, it doesn't make the most sense as a consumer, that, because I will feel is that it will have to be a burden on me every 2 weeks where I have to pay my mortgage. Like, oh, I got paid, my check is gone, basically. Right. And so after you go to Costco, you pay the bank, you pay for the if you have children, or if you have, because I know another aspect about is that oftentimes in urban areas, with the once you start going higher into that median income range, you're often looked at as the dependent upon other people in your family. So say, for example, if grandma dies, now everybody looking at, you don't want to you got to do a GoFundMe or something like that, like, versus, or if you have that family member who's well off, that's when they start calling you like, hey. And so just little factors like that minorities have to start that high earning people have to start to consider in terms of, like, life happens at the end of the day. And so if you're going to go right into that 47-48% of your monthly income, what you're going to do if your dryer breaks, your washer and dryer breaks in the same month, that's a $2,500 expense. You want to just go to the laundromat until like, what's your action plan for something like that? And so,
all good. So a couple of questions, and this is open for anybody. So one, My poor husband, I like to watch some of the, the housing shows. Either it's, redoing your house or buying houses. And I started seeing, a lot of young couples like, and their budget is $850,000. I'm like, I actually need whatever job it is that they have. Right. And then I think I read somewhere that some mortgages are longer than 30 years, or is that not correct? I mean, so what is going on? That's the first question.
Yeah. Okay. So for HGTV, what happens sometimes, I don't want to say all the time, but when I did it, I was as curious as you. Like, one is one is just a stay-at-home mom. The other guy is average Joe. Here's their pre-approval at $1 million.
Right.
And they got the camera crew and everything there. And so oftentimes what happens is they have a large down payment. Down payment. Whereas oftentimes from the outside looking in, they get gifted funds from family members for these down payment assistance programs. If any of us, call around, hey, can I need 1,000 here or there, is they're like, I'm not so sure about that. Of course, you ask your parent, your support system, maybe, but for most people, a gift, because it's called a gift letter in terms of real estate. So sometimes when you see they get pre-approved for X amount of dollars, they may have received a gift of over $200,000, and that's what pushed them over the edge of and also sometimes what happens in those type of circumstances, because I know the house flipper shows and things of that nature, that's when they start getting into a little bit of that predatory range, because what happens is anybody can be the term is called a hard money lender. And so what a hard money lender is basically an angel investor, but they charge retail store credit percentages. And it's due, the amount is due every month. That same amount is allowed to be due until you finish the job of the renovation, because they don't get the hard money lender does not get paid until the end of the transaction. And so sometimes they one of the biggest shows on HGTV is Fix or Flip, or when they do these first time flippers and they get into some trouble. And then they got called the HGTV expert to come in and say today, they obviously was in it was one episode I watched. They was in California. They was proposed I want to say $2 million was their amount that they was able to work with.
Right.
But they had no idea about the general contractor side. So people oftentimes you see stuff like that happens. It's unfortunately
there's something more. Yeah.
Yeah.
And shoot, we are out of time, but I wanted to actually get perspectives on this. So, when we talk about generational wealth, right, we talk about having that house, right? One of the aspects that sort of that whole conversation. And now I've been seeing and watching, this tiny house nation and how this whole tiny house phenomena is being pushed. And let's briefly talk about that, and what does that mean moving forward? And anyway, if that question makes sense, because I've been sort of wrestling with that, maybe a quick fix, you free up income, but if we're talking long term, or are there new ways for generational wealth now that we as sort of minorities have missed out on? So Bruce, Chazi, Charles,
Oh yeah, so I guess I can speak on the tidy. So basically the premise is to combat the affordable housing crisis. In the meantime, they reverted back to starting to create more tiny homes, create mobile homes that actually look really nice on the inside. It's just, you got to get over that. Okay, this is a mobile home anyway. And so one of the things that we notice is buyers and the traditional buyer is open. They're way more open now to achieving whatever they think of as generational wealth. Some people are lifelong renters. And so what we're starting to see more of is, it may be a lifelong renter, but let's still get you guys pre-approved at a certain amount, just so we can see what you guys can can get pre-approved at. Whereas if you guys wanted to try out the ownership route for a year, you guys still had the opportunity to either sell or rent that house out and use that rental income to help boost your monthly income for whatever next rental you want to use, or you want to invest the difference. And so just different means of generational wealth is starting to be achieved. Like people are more open. Like we're starting to have more general conversations about stocks, about mortgages, about crypto, about even like from Jordan collections to Rolexes. There's just so many different forms of asset classes now. Whereas I think it's generational wealth is a person to person thing.
Yeah, no, that's good. Bruce, final answer if you want to talk about generational wealth through your lens.
Sure, and building equity through home ownership is one of the primary ways in which Americans have traditionally produced generational wealth, and it's one of the things that has really impacted the racial wealth gap in this country, that African Americans have not been oftentimes provided the same opportunities perhaps that white families were, particularly when redlining was in effect. So we're for safe and sound and equitable opportunities for low to moderate income households to build wealth and participate in homeownership.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I had so many other questions, but that means that everyone will have to come back, because I wanted to ask about allies, alliedship. What can we do from a policy perspective? How can we impact this whole? But I think that the information that everyone shared was so foundational and really, really good for our audience to have sort of a basis. So I definitely want to have everyone back. So please don't go away while I give my closing. So we want to thank Bruce, Chazi, Charles for taking your time this evening and your expertise to really, really give us things to think about, and to think about perhaps what our responsibility is as a good citizen, as a good resident of Prince George's County, as a good resident of Maryland or the DMV. What is our responsibility when we talk about these issues, and what impact perhaps we can make? I also want to thank our incredible partners, the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, for their efforts in this event and for other programs that we collaborate with them on. We want to thank you for tuning in. And again, we want you to not only listen, but to perhaps figure out what it is that you can do in terms of action. So before we leave, I know we ran a little over. I want to highlight a couple events that are coming up this week. Tomorrow, please join us for the second night of our Prince George's County Reads as we discuss Chapter 2 of Dr. William G. Thomas III's amazing book, A Question of Freedom. If you haven't, and I usually have the book here. Oh, well, yes, right here. Hang on. Question of Freedom. If you haven't read it, you have to read it. It's about freedom suits of slaves in Prince George's County pre-Civil War and how they won their freedom. And P.S., the slaves in Prince George's County were the ones that were sold that started Georgetown University. It's a must read. So that's tomorrow night. Even if you haven't read the book, you can come, attend, listen to the discussion, participate. We had a really good discussion, our first read, and the author actually dropped in. So if you want that information, just register. It's free. Please visit us at pgcmls.info/events. And then on Thursday at 10 a.m., we welcome the author of a great children's book called The Slave Who Went to Congress. And this is part of our event partnership with the library and New South Books. You can learn more about our office, the Office of Human Rights, by visiting civilrights.mypgc.us. So thank you for joining us, and please stay safe. Remember, wash your hands, wear a mask, and let's do a little social distancing with the new variant that's here. So thank you all. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.